Hello, everybody. Today we have with us Mr. Bruce Gore. Bruce is a former teacher, and would you say you're a lay theologian? Would that be an appropriate way to characterize?
That's probably as good a way as any to put it. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Professor, lay theologian, practiced law for 20 years, 30 years on the adjunct faculty of Whitworth University in Oregon, right?
Spokane, Washington.
Washington, yes, in Washington, and a professional Sunday school teacher now.
That's right.
That's it.
So how are you? 1 hour a week.
How are you doing this evening, Mr. Gore?
Well, I'm doing very well, thank you. I'm in good health, and so I'm grateful for every new day I get.
Yep. So today I have Mr. Gore on. We are going to, well, first of all, several years ago, he released a lecture series on the historical context of the Bible. So referring to so we have in the Bible, the book of Genesis. I think you went all the way through the New Testament. Today we're going to be talking more about the Old Testament. But yeah, so the entire point of the lecture, purpose of the lecture, was to clarify the specific events and even the mythologies of different cultures too, that based on these same biblical events during the Bronze Age. So he began talking about the Genesis creation story, and then also went on to tie Noah's flood with the Epic of Gilgamesh, and all of these great traditions, which in a lot of ways are rooted in these common occurrences that all the people in the ancient Middle East and ancient Near East experienced in their own ways. So really fascinating. Goes on, talks about the Judges, the era of the Judges, the Exodus, and just everything that was going on in the wider world around them at the time, them referring to the ancient Israelites. So I'm just going to ask you a couple questions before we get started.
Okay.
What piqued your interest or piques your interest in this particular subject? What prompted you to hold that lecture series in the first place?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I was like you mentioned, I practiced law for some 20 years, and when I reached a point where I wanted to do something a little less stressful, I kind of gradually shut down my practice and got a job teaching in a Christian high school. And so my main areas were going to be civics, political theory, history. But one of the courses I was assigned to teach was called Historical Context of the Bible. And I thought, well, that sounds like fun. You know, I thought I probably knew something on the topic, and I poked around for a textbook. And I really couldn't find anything that was really useful to a high school, a bright high school junior, senior. Most of what I found was either way too technical and too detailed, or so superficial that it really just skated over the top of a fair amount of substance. And so I've never really been inclined to write a book, but this one more or less was ginned up out of my own needs. It began just as a series of kind of lecture notes and short essays, and gradually over a few years morphed itself into a book. So that's what happened.
Okay. Yeah, I'll be sure to put a link to your book. I was actually not aware that you wrote a book, but I'll put a link to it in the show notes below, in case anybody wants to check it out. And yeah, I would definitely.
The book is it's available on Amazon. It's actually sold much better than I expected, so it's been kind of a nice, gotten good reviews, and so I've been pleased with that. It was more kind of an unexpected consequence of it, but it's been nice to have it out there.
Well, congratulations. That's great to hear. And who would you say in terms of, or what piqued your interest in history in general, and what made you want to apply it to the Bible especially? Yeah. Because I do think that the great thing about your lecture series, again, I have yet to read your book, but the lecture series, just the perspective that you came from was very, very neutral too. So I think that of course you're Christian, and you stated that, but the great thing about it is it's something that I feel both people who are religious and people who aren't particularly religious but are interested in this topic can greatly benefit from without feeling alienated.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that, and I've been attempting to accomplish that. I really wasn't very interested in history when I was. I went to a small rural school in a small rural town here in Washington, and the history class was always taught by the football coach, and so he had about as much interest in history as you can imagine. He was more interested in football plays, and so I always assumed that history must be kind of a non-starter academically, not really worth much attention. Even in college, I didn't really I tried to avoid history. I just didn't think I was interested in it, so. But soon after college, I was able to bluff my way into a teaching job in a little Bible school that had just started here in Spokane. I was in broadcasting at the time, so I got a job teaching there, as teaching speech, really, and gradually morphed into an actual full-time job teaching, and discovered, much to my surprise, by teaching church history, how much interest I had in the topic, much more than I had anticipated. And so that was sort of the beginning of my interest in history. And at that time, it was history AD. It wasn't really ancient history, but it was you'd say Western history and church history.
So beginning with like Constantine the Great.
Yeah, sure. Really beginning.
My patron saint, actually.
Sure, that's the idea. And continuing, I eventually got a master's in history. I became so interested in it, so that kind of broadened my interest. And so anyway, I guess I discovered over the years that history was more of an interest to me than I had anticipated. And when I wound up teaching in this high school and they wanted me to teach historical context of the Bible, I thought, well, that sounds like fun, and so that was kind of how the whole thing got started. But I would say if I could go back and do my life over again and I was going to college, I'd probably be a history major right off the bat, because I just had no idea at the time how interesting the topic would be to me.
So what would you describe your theological background as? I recall you said in your, it was like, I think it was at the beginning of your lecture, I believe you said you're a Presbyterian, correct?
Yeah, that's right. I'm a Presbyterian in a PCUSA Presbyterian church, which is kind of the most mainstream of the Presbyterian denominations in America. I didn't grow up. I grew up actually Baptist, but Whitworth is tied to the university, or tied to Presbyterian denomination, and I kind of made the transition there sometime after college. And so I'd say broadly, you'd say I'm in what's called the Reformed tradition.
So like, would you describe yourself like theologically more Calvinist then?
Yeah, I'd say I'm a Calvinist. Okay. Go back to the Reformation as it was spelled out by Calvin. And of course, I like Luther. I like him as well. And the Puritans, especially. When I did my MA work, it was largely dealing with the Puritan history and American colonial history, which was dominated by the Puritans. And so all of that is kind of my area of interest, in terms of those issues.
Okay. Hold on a second. So would you say, like, you said you're really interested in, you were interested particularly in the Puritan history. I remember back when I was a child, I absolutely hated the Puritans.
Yeah,
because they're so puritanical. But then over time, as I read people like the metaphysical poetry of like John Donne, for instance, I sort of, even though I disagreed with some of their stances, more theologically complex than I originally thought it was. And so really interesting period in history there, but not the period of history we're going to be talking about today. So I remember, what would you say your general historical interpretation of the Bible is, because there are like different analytical traditions. Like there are like the more there's the more metaphysical analysis, the more metaphorical analysis, and then you have the literal analysis, which you could just put into two camps. Like the traditional literalists were the ones who went who would go and find what was seen as literal, what was interpreted as literal in the time in which they're written. But then you have like the like sort of the neo-literalists, which began the rooted in the fundamentalism of the early 20th century. So that would be like folks like I got the sense you're definitely not in that camp.
No, I'm not. I'm fairly, I suppose, conservative, you would say, in my theology. But it seems to me when we come to the Bible, it is essential to realize that the Bible is a conglomeration of multiple types of literary genre written by multiple authors over considerable expanses of time for different purposes to different audiences for different in different historical settings, and all of that tends to condition the biblical text, considerably, because whatever else it is a document produced by human beings living in particular human circumstances. And so I think the approach that's the wisest is simply to ask, okay, what am I reading here? Is this a poem? Is it an epic tale? Is it intended to be some kind of mythology that's teaching a deeper truth? Or is it purportedly reporting actual history? And, those are questions that can be answered. I mean, whether it's the Bible or any other piece of literature, you can usually tell if something is a poem as opposed to narrative, as opposed to parable, as opposed to, apocalyptic literature, whatever it might be. There are certain signs in the text itself that tend to guide a person in terms of understanding what they're reading. And so I think that's the right way to approach it. As a Christian, I look at the Bible and I say, well, it's the Word of God. But in terms of reading it for its historical content, I have to sort of set that aside for a moment and say, okay, somebody somewhere wrote this. And they wrote it for a reason, and they wrote it to a certain audience, and they wrote it in a certain context using certain literary tools.
Yeah, I've always seen the Bible was not written to us; it was written for us,
That's
specifically
right.
us in the contemporary
Exactly.
age.
Yeah,
which is why I'm always, and this was even before. So I've become more religious again very recently. I was raised Episcopalian, sort of drifted away, spent some time as a deist, somewhat agnostic, but I wouldn't necessarily apply that label. But then very recently I've started, I mean, of course the churches haven't really opened up where I am right now, and I think I'm too lazy to do the online one. I guess I just want to sleep in, but I have been substituting that by reading a lot of theology lately.
Yeah, good. So that's great.
Yeah, and I guess Anglicanism, Presbyterianism, the two American religious traditions, more or less.
It's really true, and in fact, I'm presently my Sunday school class. I'm teaching Revelation, but next fall my plan is to do a series for a year called Presbyterians in the American Revolution.
Okay.
It could be Anglicans in the American Revolution. It could be Baptists. I just happen to be Presbyterian, so that's going by that name.
I remember modern Presbyterianism inspired a lot by like the Northern Congregationalists, right? Like
that's right.
I think
that's right.
John Adams and
yes. The New England states were largely congregational in their church governance, but they were fundamentally Presbyterian, and indeed really Calvinistic in their theology. So you had Presbyterians largely in the middle states, Pennsylvania, North and South Carolina, in those areas. The New England states to the north were congregational, and there were political reasons for that, but their theology was quite similar. In fact, almost identical, I would say, to the middle states as well. And then the southern, you had more kind of a Baptist influence that began to show up there.
Yeah, I remember. So I think it was in your first lecture. I could be wrong because I think that I binged them about 6 months ago or so. This was back during the summer, because I mean I'm writing a book myself, and I'm looking for all the resources
for you.
possible. Thank you. It's probably not going to be for. I'd give it 20 years. That's how that's how much how intense and intimidating and big and at least in terms of all the stuff I want to say. I won't get into that though. This is not about me, but I recall, I think it was in that first lecture, you said that because you have that very your interpretation of the Bible, you said that oftentimes Christian fundamentalists will call you a liberal, and then you'll have secularists who will call you a conservative, and then you said whatever it is, I'm that. Like if I'm a liberal, I'm a liberal. If I'm a conservative, I'm a conservative. This is just the particular. But yeah. So anyway, I was thinking we could start with. So we're not gonna end up going story for story for story, of course. But one thing I was gonna say about 5 minutes ago, when you're talking about the different literary genres in the Bible, in a lot of ways, I'd say the Bible is very unique among a lot of other religious traditions in that all of these things are compiled into a single anthology, whereas you have like a lot of the ancient pagan religions, which are all these disparate stories and tales, and nowadays when we read Greek myths, it reads to us like ridiculous fiction, whereas at the time they were trying to make sense of deeper metaphysical truths that, I mean, of course, I mean, they got the gods wrong, but but it was still
it was a valiant effort to try to explain the mystery of human existence using story. And I think most self-respect, like, the Greek myths, Greeks knew that this wasn't real history. They never took it that way. They took it as an attempt to capture some insight into the character of human existence using story to accomplish it, And I think the ancient Mesopotamians were probably trying to do something like that with the Enuma Elish. They were trying to say something about the universe as they perceived it, and they were using various kind of mythological characters to accomplish that purpose. And they really did a pretty good job, I think. Overall.
And that actually, so I had an interview a couple days ago with the author. He wrote a book recently on sort of the influence of perennialism. Well, I mean, of course, the perennialists, they can get a bit too Gnostic at times, but what's really interesting, and again, this ties back to where we're about to start with the creation story, but how a lot of these religious traditions have these very, very common themes. They're the same story told in different ways. Like you have in Hinduism, the idea of the yugas and the fall of man. That is a universally it's in pretty much every religion. And then the 4 ages of man, with Hesiod and Ovid, from like Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age. And in a sense, you could, if you look deeper in the book of Genesis, you see that too. It is Adam, Eve, Abel, and Cain in a lot of respects, kind of representing those, representing just those, like those different, basically the spiritual, like the gradual spiritual degeneration of multiple like generations of man, more or less. And
because anyone that just observes the human situation knows, we all have an intuition that things should be better than they are. I think most people have a kind of undefined nostalgia about life as it ought to be, almost like it's a memory of a paradise from which we, somehow lost our status, and now we see constant bloodshed, we see threats, we see people behaving poorly, and it tells us, and we know intuitively, hey, it's not supposed to be this way. Every politician gets up and says, I'm going to make your life better,
make America great again.
And so, even if a person doesn't have a Bible, they can sit down and figure an awful lot of this out just by a thoughtful reflection on what you see around you all the time. It seems to me that that sort of perennialism you're talking about there, if I understand that term correctly, is simply saying that we do have these themes that sort of undergird every civilization, every expression of human imagination and speculation.
Yeah. So anyway, to get now to get to the meat and bones of this book of Genesis, the creation myth. And when I say myth, I don't mean fiction,
Sure.
because the words fiction and myth are too often seen as synonymous, whereas myth just means religious, like a religious story.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, so the Genesis creation myth, of course, there are two, but what is the where did that come from originally? Because I mean, it's similar to a lot of others, but I recall,
I wish I could tell you.
Because I remember I've read before, and this was the most fascinating theory, but that it was actually based on an older temple dedication ritual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
About the.
I know I can't speak with much authority on that. I know I've come across that theory. My view of it, it seems to me that, for example, when you read the most famous, of course, Mesopotamian creation myth was Enuma Elish. There are others. They have certain common themes in them, but Enuma Elish is the most intact and probably comprehensive. And it assumes a certain view of the cosmos. It's got a notion of, sort of a flat Earth inside this kind of protected bubble, you might say.
Yeah, the dome, and
it floats in a great salt sea, and so on. So you got this. When you read Genesis chapter 1, you would say that Genesis chapter 1 actually seems to presuppose the universe looking just like that. In other words, you've got a firmament. That's the same thing as a dome. You've got water above the dome. You've got water below the dome. In other words, you've got something that sounds like Mesopotamian sort of anthropomorphic descriptions of the universe. And yet, when you read Genesis 1, you realize that the way that the story is told, even though it assumes that particular view of the universe, does not simply march along in lockstep with the story that was told by the Mesopotamians. And in fact, you might even say it's sort of a critique. And I think that's what it is. I think it was written later. I mean, I don't think you would say the Hebrews borrowed from them, but I think
at first, a lot of I assume the very earliest proto-Israelites probably believe it was probably the Enuma, Enuma Elish. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, that's
like
right.
The very first ones, probably Abraham. That was probably the tradition they came out of too.
Well, sure, and you have to say that if we didn't know any better, if we just walked outside and looked around, we'd probably reach a very similar conclusion, because you look at the blue sky, it looks like a big dome, and it's blue, so it suggests to somebody maybe there's water up there. In other words, it's not like this is some kind of completely outrageous conclusion to reach just based on observation. Now we, presumably know better. We sending people to the moon, that kind of thing, but nevertheless, the casual observer might reach those conclusions. It seems to me the message of Genesis is to say, however, that this creation did not originate in some kind of great struggle between titanic forces with an outcome that was uncertain, but that there was a very powerful, highly dignified, sovereign mind that was responsible for this. And so you don't read anything of a kind of a dualistic conflict, Tiamat, fighting against Marduk or something like that. You just don't have it. You have what amounts to a great affirmation that the universe came into being for good purposes out of the creative genius of a good God. And that's quite different, actually, quite different from the Mesopotamian account of things.
Yeah. And also what I noticed was really fascinating is when they talk about how he created all these, like he created the animals of the earth, the sun, the moon, and the stars. It's almost as if they're sort of poking fun at the Mesopotamian gods in some instance, because it's basically saying, yeah, he created what the Mesopotamians believe that their gods were, because they believe, for instance, that these forces of nature were like those gods themselves in a sense.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah.
So next, so the story of the Garden of Eden and the fall of man, which, as we talked about earlier, is in some ways with major variations. You see it in a lot of other societies. So what are the origins of that? Because in a lot of ways it seems almost like an inverted Sumerian, Babylonian, Assyrian story, because their version of Garden of Eden was basically Eridu, which was a city, which was basically the seen as the center of ancient civilization, what was ancient to them. Whereas for the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's a garden.
Right.
And
the Mesopotamians had a dill moon as well. It was kind of a paradise situation. And actually, the Gilgamesh epic, Utnapishtim, is the kind of Noah character there, and he makes allusions to what could be construed to be a tree of life, such as you hear in the biblical account. The biblical account paints a very, I think, delicious picture of human creation in the original setting being one in which there was a wonderful kind of peace and stability and joy. I mean, it's really a lovely picture. And like I say, it seems to me that you don't have to push a person very hard to realize that we all have within us a kind of intuition of such a thing. I think sometimes utopianism in history in its various forms has been an attempt to try to recover some lost memory, some intuition of that sort of paradise situation. Whether it actually happened as advertised, that's obviously an open question, and good people differ on that. But something like that seems to be, in other words, you have to ask yourself the question, why is it that humankind is so ripped apart by vicious, just awful, ghastly behavior? It's the world hangs on a thread, not because of a dispute among kangaroos. It's not monkeys that are at war. It's not camels that are creating. It's human beings. And so here we are on the one hand, supposedly the most enlightened, intelligent, brilliant, and yet at the same time, we are throwing bricks through windows and burning down buildings and killing and starting wars. And what is it? What's wrong with us? I mean, there's something in the human psyche that says something went haywire here somewhere. And so, the biblical account is, there was a moment when there was a cataclysmic reversal in which somehow we committed treason against the situation of our creation, and we've been paying the piper ever since in some way or other.
So moving on sort of from the Garden of Eden and the initial fall, because what a lot of I feel like a misunderstand, like a basically a I want to say a elementary understanding or reading of it, like the fall of man is specifically affiliated with Adam and Eve, whereas it really went all the way till the flood. Like that was with like Cain and Abel, it was like a gradual process. So this is something I just seen floated around various writings online, and then also some theological works from the early 20th century when they were starting to learn about like the Neolithic Revolution, about Cain and Abel representing the transition from sort of a pastoral or hunter-gatherer society to transitioning to an agrarian city-building society. Because Cain, he built the first cities. And it just seems like that seemed like a very interesting perspective, at least from when I read it.
Yeah, it's the opportunities for speculation are endless. We do know that Sumer in southern Mesopotamia, which may be the same thing as what's called Shinar, Shinar, in the biblical narrative.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that.
Yeah, well, it's some people view it as controversial, but I think that's probably correct. But the point is, we do know that human sort of organized, civilized behavior in which city-states figured out some way to work cooperatively rather than in adversarial ways, it was good for everybody. It was there that they kind of invented irrigation, drawing water out of the Tigris and Euphrates. And all of a sudden you're able to grow crops on a fairly steady, predictable basis rather than, as you say, the hunter-gatherer thing. Whether or not we can connect that to Cain and Abel, I don't know. I'm not opposed to that idea. I think you have to do a lot of connecting of dots that may or may not be there all that clearly, but it seems to me that however it happened, the biblical account is certainly not radically inconsistent with that idea, the development of human civilization, building cities, that sort of thing. And so to me, there's some kind of compatibility there that is worth at least exploring. I don't consider myself any kind of top drawer scholar in this. Basically what I did was read a bunch of books and report what I read, and so I didn't do groundbreaking research by any means in this area. I'm just trying to report what I think the best scholars out there had said and make it accessible to a bunch of high schoolers. So
that's important, though. That is a very important.
Yeah.
That is a very important thing to do, because I mean, we definitely need more people in today's society who be able to convey all of this knowledge to people who might not be able to digest the the works. Yeah, the works as easy. Yeah. But in terms of the Great Flood, moving on to there, I've noticed. So I think today, I mean, I won't go into the theories because that's not really particularly relevant, but more or less confirmed that there was some kind of primordial event that shook the Near East, at least the Near East. Yeah, I mean, there are other theories that say it was semi-global too, but I've noticed that a lot of young Earth creationist types who I most certainly do not agree. I think that there's a lot of problems with their theology. But for instance, you see like those Ken Ham, the Creation Institute, they seem like so dead set on the idea that the universal flood was the entire world, whereas I don't even think the original translation said it covered the whole globe. It said universal and world. The whole world to them was not the globe, because like they thought it was just like their place, like right there. What would you have to say about that? Because frankly, I don't think it matters whether or not it was covered the entire globe or if it was the civilized world at the time, because the story still has the same fundamental, it conveys the same fundamental truth either way.
Yeah. And at this point, I'd be happy to go either way. I don't again consider myself a particularly impressive expert on it. I do think that it certainly the biblical language, using a word like world, it was written at a time when the whole idea of how you define world would be totally different than how we would think of it. They weren't thinking of a globe. They weren't thinking of, of planets and a solar system or anything like that. They had nothing like that in their heads. Now, people who are hardcore, sort of, fundamental in their outlook will say, well, God just explained it to them, and that was that. And okay, fine, I'm willing to go with that. That's okay, but I don't think we have to necessarily, embrace that. I think people wrote from the perspective of their understanding of things. I think they wrote accurately. I think they wrote in a way that can be very useful to us. It shouldn't be discounted because they were writing from the worldview that was current at that point. But at the same time, when we hear a word like world, we should do at least a little bit of fair assessment of what that word probably meant to the person that actually used it. And if that's the case, then the flood could have been a vast deluge, but local to that part of the world. If somebody can prove that it was a worldwide flood, fine, I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
Either way is okay, but I don't think the text itself demands that we reach that conclusion. And so I just would proceed with some caution, I guess, when people try to get too much mileage out of particular words.
It seems like we're so concerned with empiricism these days.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's kind of, it limits basically how people view what truth is. Yeah. More or less.
Right.
And, but yeah, I've also seen in terms of the flood dating, because I mean, you really start to see, I think it was James Ussher back in the 1600s who a lot of them, they based their model off of, whereas even he was just working at what they had at the time, because there's no way for them to prove how old the earth was. It's like, okay, let's just use the Bible. That's what we have for now. So it made sense for them back then. But so his dating put the flood at 2350, I think it was 2350 BC.
Something like that.
But whereas like with what we know now, it was probably about 1,000 years before that. Not gonna presume, but it was. But then you have the people again, like the Creation Institute people, who say that it happened then, when we have evidence that, for instance, that would have been around the time of Sargon the Great, and he would have had to have survived the flood if that was the case, and that completely goes against, like, it just seems like a very limited view of looking at it.
Yeah, and I'm at that point, I'm just kind of hands off. My own kind of assessment of it seems to me that there was some kind of great flood, that virtually every ancient civilization refers to it. Most of them refer to it as something that took place in something of a distant past, meaning hundreds of years. And so kind of off the top of my head, it seems to me it must have been somewhere around 3,000 or even earlier. But beyond that, I'm willing to just defer to people who are more expert on the topic than I am.
But yeah, it's what forget who it was who said this, but it may have been I don't know if it was Aristotle or Socrates, but it was, a philosopher is he who knows that he does not know everything. Yeah.
Who was? So, I want to say that that sounds like Socrates, actually. I
think it was Socrates.
Anyway. That's a great quote, and I think that's a little bit of a bit of wisdom, when you are willing to frankly acknowledge that you may not have all the right answers, and I'm the first in line to say that. So.
But so moving on then from the flood, I think one of the most underrated, it's my favorite story, probably. Yeah, definitely in Genesis. One of my favorites in the entire Old Testament, Genesis 11.
Yeah.
Real about the Shinar. We were just talking about that. The city builders building the tower, and I don't recall, or I could be wrong because it was such a long series. But if you touched on that in your series, but what would you say the context for
the Tower
of
Babel? Yeah, I didn't really do much with that. There is, and I was just coming across this recently, and it's not fresh enough in my mind right now to say much more than just that I came across it. But there was some allusion to some other accounts that had a similar kind of theme to them, a kind of dividing up of languages, that sort of thing, that was outside the Bible. I've never been able to nail that down, and so I'm kind of at a loss as to point you in much of a direction. But it does seem to me that the story is significant because it in some ways was intended to make the point that if human beings are going to, if they are going to progress, if they're going to proceed in a positive, healthy direction that's good for them, then they must do it in submission to the God of heaven, not in an attempt to try to overthrow the God of heaven. And in some ways, the Tower of Babel stands there as a warning that our attempts to unite in some sort of great consolidated human, effort to more or less prove that we can be our own God, or ultimately
the first humanist movement.
Yeah, exactly. They're doomed to fail. And how many times in history has it happened? I mean, I don't know how many utopians there have been in history who have come along and like Karl Marx, workers of the world unite. It's kind of a Tower of Babel thing. I mean, there's multiple other ones, that have sort of wanted to find some basis upon which to unite the human race in some sort of statist belief that we can get along fine without God, that we can actually sort of be God. And it seems like they're all doomed to failure. And in some ways, the Tower of Babel stands there as the great initial warning. Ain't gonna fly. You're just not gonna pull it off if you try to do this without submitting to the God who put us here in the first place. So whether it's that story or others, it seems to me that there's a lesson there that's probably worth taking seriously.
Yeah, well, what I also thought was interesting, I don't know if you've ever read Josephus before.
Yeah.
But his theory was the Tower of Babel, and by that he was probably just referring to Ziggurats in general.
Mm-hmm.
Their initial purpose was to, and again, this is just his theory, but it's one that's not widely talked about these days, but about how they were initially, because there's no mountains in Mesopotamia like there are in like, because they, like it said the Bible, people of Shinar came out of like the Zagros mountains. So it was originally to create artificial mountains to escape the constant flooding. And he said
theory.
Nimrod, like, which is what I know Nimrod I think originally comes from Enoch, but according to Josephus, that's who built the tower. I've always liked to think it's actually like Nimrod and Gilgamesh were. That's my fan theory.
Yeah, that's a popular theory. So you're in good company on that. You may very well be correct, but it is true. It was an area that was given to floods. It was kind of a swampy area, the southern Mesopotamia, and the Ziggurats were. There were a lot of them. I mean, there's still a bunch over there to this day, and they were.
I wish it was safer. That would be an amazing tourist destination.
It'd be a great place to tour. You bet. Hopefully someday that'll kind of settle down and we can run over and take a look at those. But they're amazing structures, and they were purportedly. They were religious structures. The whole idea was the priests would go up to the top into a little kind of chapel. At the very top of this thing, and that was where they would meet with the gods. This was presumably where Hammurabi was able to get Hammurabi's code, that sort of thing, that this was a place of meeting between God in heaven and men on earth. So they're very interesting. It seems to me that the story in the Bible, at least, is compatible with what we know about those structures otherwise.
So moving on then to Abraham. There are multiple kind of theory, and I know like really we're so today obsessed with trying to find out which theory is correct and literal, and that kind of detracts from the whole point. That trying to search for that, but there are like multiple theories of when exactly Abraham lived. Like I've heard some have said like 22nd century. Of course, it was during the third dynasty of Ur, most likely, or a little after maybe. But
my own view is that Abraham was born not long after the kind of the fall of the third dynasty in what would amount to an intermediate period in which you didn't have any single dominating power. So
it's like their dark ages, basically.
Yeah,
after the fall of Rome, and
that, sort of like that. Abraham was. Now, many people want to put his birth much earlier. I've seen people wanting to say, well, he was born around 2200, BC. I think it's
that
more
seems
about,
too early for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's probably closer to the middle of the 1900s BC. Part of the reason they push it back so far is they're trying to accommodate an idea that the children of Israel were enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. Which I think is a mistaken understanding of what the text actually says.
Sure. If you look at numerology too.
Yeah, to allow for 400 years, you have to push Abraham back a couple of hundred years, and it creates other problems. So anyway, it seems to me that, I'm not going to die on this hill, but I think he's probably born a little bit later, probably in the mid 1900s BC, something like that.
Okay.
And that would put it just a little bit after the fall of the third dynasty of Ur.
Another possibility too, maybe it was right before the third dynasty of Ur, and that compelled him to leave because he saw them coming in. I don't know. That's just thought of that one. But.
Yeah, it could be, but that would raise a few chronological challenges there.
Yeah,
say the least. So,
but so moving on to the time of this next one has to do sort of with Abraham as well, but the Battle of Sidon, would you say I think it was like the Siddim, I forget if that was it or not, but it was the one you had the five kings.
Okay, yeah.
So is there any particular historical event that people theorize that describes, or would you say that is more of an epic, more in the vein of like the Song of Roland?
Well, I think the biblical narrative tells the story expecting us to believe that something along those lines happened, and I'm inclined to think it probably did, but it wouldn't be a battle that would rise to the level that would necessarily create archives that we would be reading these days. There was a battle, for example, the Battle of Kadesh, let's say.
Oh, yeah. First international peace treaty.
That's
I think,
right. Yeah. Well, see, that was a huge international conflict, and we have records that are extant that we can go back and. Well, this was kind of a local skirmish. It wasn't the Battle of Chedorlaomer and his the kings that came with him to do battle against Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, skirmishes like that happened all the time, and I don't think we would reasonably expect to have all kinds of archives that would give historical evidence of it. It's at the same time we know that things like that happened enough that for the Bible to say there was such a skirmish doesn't offend us. We wouldn't say, oh, nothing like that could have happened, because in fact stuff like that was happening all the time. It just, the reason it made it into the biblical story was it happened to affect Abraham's life because his nephew Lot was, captured in the process, and so all of a sudden we have a story in the Bible, and you have Abraham interacting with a guy named Melchizedek, and that becomes very important from a biblical point of view. But I'd say in terms of ancient historical events, it's probably pretty low on the totem pole of major areas that we would be really expecting to have kind of external records of to this at this time in history.
So you take more of a minimalist view on that particular
of the size of the conflict.
Yeah. You mentioned Melchizedek.
Mm-hmm.
That is like one of the most confusing, mysterious figures, I would say, in the Bible. Do you think you could explain who he was, at least? I mean, not necessarily. I'm not in the historical sense, but at least in context of the Bible.
Yeah. He's mentioned only twice in the Old Testament, once in Genesis 14 and once in Psalm 110. In Genesis 14, he meets Abraham returning from that very battle and presents to him bread and wine, which of course has a very sacramental kind of element to it. And it represents for Abraham this moment of truth, because there were two kings that confronted him. One is called the king of Sodom, and one is called the king of Salem. King of Sodom is wanting to make a deal. Abraham was a major sheik. If the biblical record is correct, he was a man of astronomical wealth, and so he was respected as a character with a fair amount of power. And so Sodom is now negotiating with a fellow who's just won, a significant battle. And the king of Salem comes along on the other hand and says, Abraham, the only reason you won this battle was God did it for you, and you therefore need to acknowledge that he is the one you should be serving and worshiping. And of course, Abraham goes with the king of Salem rather than the king of Sodom. Well, that becomes very important from a biblical point of view, because it represents a moment when Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation, and therefore all of those who would come after him, in a sense, are bowing the knee to a guy who is presented as a king priest who shows up out of the blue and then disappears from the pages of history. It's just this cameo appearance of a dude that we don't know anything about him. He just is there. But the fact that Abraham acknowledges his authority becomes extremely important in the New Testament, because the Christian affirmation of Jesus is that he was a priest. In fact, he is the great priest. And the Jewish objection was, well, hey, wait, how can he be a priest if he doesn't descend from Levi, which is the Levitical tribe, that gave rise to the priests? And the New Testament answer was, well, because the Old Testament says he's a priest after the order of Melchizedek. And that's Psalm 110. And insofar as Abraham acknowledged the authority of Melchizedek, it becomes an argument that Melchizedek is a superior priest to Levi. And so Christ can come on the scene with a priesthood that exceeds the Jewish priesthood in Levi, and becomes an argument for Christ then in the New Testament as the priest king to whom the Jewish people should be diverting their allegiance. And that's kind of one of the many issues in the New Testament that's sort of trotted out as an argument that Christ is the legitimate one to claim the allegiance of God's people, not only the Jewish people, but everybody in the world. So Melchizedek is pretty important, even though he's fairly obscure, and that's the argument that's made.
Yeah, it almost seems like there could be a link between Melchizedek and sort of the ancient Magian mysteries too, that you saw around that time. Like you think of like Zarathustra and those guys. I don't know. It's just interesting, just in terms of how they were viewed and how they were revered, and sort of they passed down this knowledge. I'm not gonna die on that hill, but it's definitely lines up.
Yeah, and Zarathustra and the whole Persian religious scheme, I want to say, probably doesn't develop very clearly until sometime later. So it'd be a stretch, I would think, to tie Melchizedek to that. But then again, Persian records are until we get down to around the year 800, we know very, very little about the Persians. That's when they kind of rose to the surface and showed up on the historical radar. But so what happened before that is a little bit harder to track.
Like people have tried to date, I know, Zarathustra. Some people put him at like 600. Some people put him at like 700, 1,000. Some people put him around the same time as Moses, which is, you mentioned Melchizedek, king of Salem. What is Salem? Is there a relation potentially with Jerusalem, or? Yeah,
it actually is commonly thought that it was the earlier name for Jerusalem. So Jerusalem. Shalom is the word there, the Hebrew word. It means peace. So Melchizedek was the king of a city called called peace. Shalom. And
interesting.
And then his name itself, Melchizedek, Melech, is the Hebrew word for king, and Zedek is the Hebrew word for righteousness. So he has an interesting constellation of sort of meanings connected with him. King of Salem, King of Righteousness, that idea. He is a kind of Christ figure. Some people think it actually was Christ showing up in a pre-incarnate
yeah, that was. I think I think that one originated with like the Gnostics originally, because a lot of like Gnosticism, I think there's a bit heavy reincarnation element there too, in some of them.
There's that theory. I think
some have said he was Shem too. I think
we're given. I think it's intentional that we're not given a lot of information about him, because the only point really from the Old Testament point of view is that Abraham acknowledged his authority.
Okay.
And that in itself makes the case from a New Testament point of view for the superior priestly capacity of Christ, as opposed to the Levitical priesthood that would have been recognized in the Jewish world at the time. And beyond that, I'm not sure that the Bible's trying to say anything more about him that really we need to be too worried about. I may be too glib about that, but it just seems to me he's so obscure in the Old Testament. That's about as much as we can make of it.
It's almost I think Augustine talked about this too in City of God. It's very arrogant of us as humans to try to look at those more mysterious parts of the Bible and try to give our own very specific interpretations of them, because that's not necessarily what God was trying to tell us. Yeah. So
there's a very, I think, legitimate principle of Bible interpretation that we should start by simply asking the question, what is this book trying to say? Not what do I want it to say, or what agenda am I trying to bring to it, but just read it for its facial sense first, and then build bridges from what is clear to what may be less clear. But I'm appalled at the number of times I've come across people who latch onto something that's quite obscure and build a whole theology around it and kind of make it their whole calling card.
I think of like a lot of the I think you have like a lot of the apocalyptic or the sort of whole end of the world interpretation of the book of Revelation, the whole Left Behind thing, where a lot of people are basing their theology off of a fiction series.
Yeah, I think there's a fair amount of risk in just finding little tidbits here and there, and using them to build a whole scheme of understanding what the Bible may otherwise be saying, which is almost being ignored, for the sake of this one little piece of the puzzle that people get excited about.
So moving on to Joseph. So what's really, and I think I anticipate what your answer is going to be, but my audience probably doesn't. But in terms of Joseph going to Egypt, so there was the Pharaoh who knew Joseph, and then there was the Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, who was the Pharaoh, Moses's like step grandfather, or or I mean, not the Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. I said so what was the shift there? Because obviously there was some kind of dynastic line in Egypt that were very welcoming to the Israelites and other, and I know there was like a Semitic migration at the time too. But so what's that about, more or less?
Well, it's of course there's again, I don't want to be overly dogmatic, but my own view of it, I'll give you what I think is going on there. The Pharaoh that came along, who as the book of Exodus says, did not know Joseph, was apparently almost the first, who was the first ruler of the 18th dynasty of Egypt. And this would have been after, of course, Joseph was dead. I mean, obviously he'd been dead for some time, but the statement, this ruler did not know Joseph, is more of a way of saying did not want to accommodate a favorable view of the contribution Joseph made. He's unhappy with that. And if the timing is correct, the 18th dynasty would be in the mid 1500s BC, and prior to that, the 17th, 16th, 17th dynasties. It was an intermediate period in Egyptian history when there wasn't one overall ruling authority. There were, Lower Egypt and Southern and Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt, as it was usually called, were ruled by different authorities, and the region of Lower Egypt, which is actually northern Egypt, was ruled for a time by some people who had migrated in, known as the Hyksos. And the Hyksos, it wasn't a military takeover. They just kind of migrated in, but they were competent, and they eventually wound up in positions of rule. And there were, at least for a time, some Hyksos pharaohs.
You think Joseph could have been one of the Hyksos, or in his brothers?
Yeah, I don't think so. That's a very popular theory, and I wouldn't dismiss it out of hand. But it seems to me what we know about the Hyksos and what we know about Hebrew in slavery in Egypt and the whole story of what led to it suggests to me that they were probably cousins, but not the same thing. What the Hebrews in Egypt were not the Hyksos. I don't think. I think that would be certainly a minority view, to say the least.
Plus, chronologically, that wouldn't make much.
It would be difficult.
Sense.
Yeah. But
so, do you have we're at an hour. Do you have maybe like another 20 minutes or so?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to get at least to David. So, but
I was just going to say that I think the explanation for the favorable reception that Joseph received in Egypt was because he was dealing with a Hyksos pharaoh,
Oh, okay.
And you see, but the 18th dynasty, Amos, was actually native Egyptian, and he hated the Hyksos. It was his father, Kamos, who had actually been responsible for driving the Hyksos out. And so you might say this was kind of like a purge, where now Amos wants to rid himself of the memory of not only the Hyksos, but of all Semitic types, including the Hebrews, including Joseph. And so that's why he takes this hostile attitude toward the Hebrews that were still there. That's a theory. I didn't originate that theory, but to me, it's kind of appealing to see it that way.
There's another similar one. I personally not a huge fan of it, but especially because it places the Exodus hundreds of years before it likely happened. But it was that the Hyksos and the Hebrews were one and the same, and the Exodus was them being expelled. Not a fan of that one, but I know there was some History Channel documentary about 10 years ago that had something like that.
Yeah, but that's out there. I think it creates more problems than it solves, but hey, it's just good, clean fun. People throw
History Channel
up and see what happens. Sure, it's fine.
So one question I have for you though, so when you were doing your lecture series and you got to the first one I actually listened to, lecture series of yours was the one on Moses. And because I actually discovered your lecture series through another YouTube channel called The Study of Antiquity in the Middle Ages, who ended up posting your video on Moses. Okay. And so that's how I discovered you. All right. But so you end up going with, so there are two dominant theories regarding the dating of the Exodus. There's the 13th century theory, and then there's the traditional 15th century BC theory. What made you go with the early Exodus as opposed to the later Exodus?
Well, for a couple of reasons. One, which may be the most easiest to digest, is that when Solomon started building the temple, it's pretty well commonly assumed that, in other words, the chronology from the time of Solomon on is pretty easy to follow, and usually the date for his beginning of the construction of the temple is put in around the year 967 or so BC, And the text specifically says, in connection with Solomon building the temple, that he did so 480 years after the Exodus. And so if you do the arithmetic, that puts you in the year 1447 or thereabouts BC. And so that would be the 15th century BC. And so on the face of it, that would be that's when you'd think the Exodus would take place. The reason that the later date has been postulated, which puts it in the 19th dynasty under Ramses II, is because there are references in the biblical text to two cities, which actually include names of cities that didn't exist until later. And so you've got this anachronistic problem then if the Exodus took place earlier than the cities that are being referred to. And that's why you have many people take the view of the 13th.
That seems a little about to say that seems like a little flimsy upon which to like base the 13th century Exodus, just because it's possible that they just used those names like when they're writing the story. They just used those names sort of as symbols for.
Well, actually, there were cities there, but they changed their names.
Okay.
I think that's the explanation. So you've got a later writer referring to the city by its currently known name rather than a name that had fallen into disuse. And that is done. I mean, it's like I live in Spokane, Washington. Well, the original name of this city was Spokane Falls. But, if I were going to talk about this city at a time when it was called Spokane Falls, no one is going to fault me for just calling it Spokane, because that's what it's called today. That's what people recognize as the name of this location. It is an intentional anachronism, but it's permissible, and it happens all the time. And I think that's the explanation for what took place in the account of these cities that are referred to in the Bible. At least that certainly there's some competent scholars that would take that view, and that seems persuasive to me.
So if Moses, if we place him as being born, if the Exodus happened in like 1447, that means Moses would have been born sometime in the early or 16th century. So like maybe so somewhere about 1520 to 1500, somewhere around there. So would that make, just lining that up, would that make the princess who pulled him out of the water, would that make her potentially Hatshepsut?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, that's the view I take in my book. I certainly, the preamble says this is speculation. I'm not teaching this as known fact, but the chronology lines up so neatly that I think anybody would at least have to entertain the possibility that, in fact, it was Hatshepsut, and that she, in fact, may have been grooming her adopted son Moses to be her successor.
So she didn't like the
she didn't like her stepson, Thutmose III. There was no love lost between them. And as it turns out, he was able to rally support in the military to basically eliminate Hatshepsut. And that may be why Moses had to abandon the palace and go out to unite with his people. It would have been about that same time frame. So my view is that nobody knows for sure, but that's certainly a hypothesis worth entertaining.
So what do you so this is like a fun one that I think is like, given where we are right now in history, and we're talking about Moses, just to bring up, I mean, it is a little out there, but logically it makes some sense. I think it was Sigmund Freud who came up with it, but that there's a link between Moses and Akhenaten.
Oh yeah, I don't know. I wasn't aware that Freud said that, but that's been suggested.
It could have been Jung. I think it was Freud though.
I don't know. I can't conceive. I mean, you would have to basically ignore or utterly rewrite the biblical narrative to come up with that view. Akhenaten was a monotheist. I mean, that's kind of where the similarity ends, But
plus, at this time, I think the Hebrews were still considered henotheist. called henotheists, right?
Well, hard to say. That's been a popular theory that they sort of evolved into a monotheistic outlook. But that's kind of a different question. But Akhenaten was, by the biblical reckoning of chronology, he would have been the Pharaoh at the time that the children of Israel were in the period of the Judges, and were actually putting pressure on Phoenicia, which is why Ribabi, who was one of the Phoenician kings, was sending desperate letters to Akhenaten, pleading with him to come and help fight against these people that he called the Apiru, which may very well be another word for Hebrews, who were in their period of the conquest, pushing pressure to the north into Phoenician territory. And the Phoenicians were feeling the squeeze because at the same time the Hittites were pushing in from the north under Suppiluliuma, who was a Hittite king. And so the Phoenicians, who had always been relying on Egypt for support, are kind of left twisting in the wind. And the Tel Armana letters that go back and forth were really desperate pleas for Akhenaten to come in and help. And it's just hard to imagine any construction of the data that would allow for Akhenaten to be Moses. It just, it obviously would be Herculean rewriting of what seems to be a sensible view of things. So I'm not going to go very far down that road. And
what I think is, what I've always said about the or thought about the Exodus, like I've seen so many, like you see them all over YouTube. It's generally, it's a lot of the times it's anti-theists, and then some of them are like more more mythicist people. So not necessarily anti-theist, but people who just say like all of this has to do like zodiacs and stuff. So it's a little out there, but so there've been a lot of content on there, and there've been books written that basically, and you even see this with some empiricist historians as well. So more in the secular camp, but who are almost seem to go out of their way to try and disprove the Exodus. Like it seems like that they make that their entire concentration. And I think that kind of misses the point in a sense, because like regardless of, so even if the Exodus did not happen in the way it was said in the Bible, or even did not happen at all, hypothetically, I don't believe that, but even if that were the case, I don't think it would detract at all from the meaning of the book of Exodus itself. Because the thing is, the book of Exodus, like what if you're trying to understand the mindsets of the writers and the Jews, what tells you more about them and the way they saw the world? Looking at the literal event that happened or lack thereof, or the story of the Exodus that they wrote, because I think that gives far more insight into their mindset, into how they saw the world, than any sort of empirical.
Well, it's an interesting ongoing debate about the historical evidence for the Exodus, and I think there may be more that will develop over time. But one thing I think is interesting, and it kind of goes with the point you're making, there is no single event in Jewish history that is cited more often or given more importance than the Exodus. All through the rest of the Old Testament history from that time on, there is no event of Jewish history that is more frequently referred to, and it's not even a close call, than the Exodus. Clear up into the prophets, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, all of these, the allusions back to the Exodus are repeated and emphatic. And the fundamental theme that is always connected to the Exodus is that this was the moment of liberation, and that there is a kind of idea.
It's the national origin story for Israel.
Exactly, that this was the point of being liberated from bondage. And that, now it would be hard to imagine that a pure myth would take on that kind of importance proportionately if something like that didn't actually happen. But that's not the argument I'm making. I'm just simply saying that from a
I
Jewish
agree.
point of view, you couldn't come up with an event that would exceed in importance the Exodus. It is the Passover event. In other words, all the things that tie back to it are so just astonishingly important to the Jewish people that whatever else it was a defining moment, probably the defining moment of the Jewish story in the Old Testament.
Okay, so there were three final parts I wanted to talk about before we wrap things up.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to touch on one of my favorite books, very underrated, and basically the Game of Thrones of the Bible, the Judges, the Book of the Judges.
Yeah.
And then want to go on just talk about David and Solomon, and then finally the Babylonian captivity.
Okay.
But so starting with the Judges, well, that does deal with that same constant theme of sort of degeneration in a society losing touch, and then a judge comes and saves them, brings them back into like a brief golden age. But yeah, so that happened, and this is something that I found really fascinating. So if you take the old or the early Exodus, which you and I both subscribe to, that would put the Book of Judges, that would make it at roughly the same time as the Greek heroic age.
Yes.
So the Trojan War and the story, and like all the stories that of like Theseus and the Minotaur and all that, and which very similarly could be those could be exaggerated versions of real events referring to Greek mythology. And but either way, there are a lot of similarities in terms of like the archetypical the judges, like the heroes that you see in Judges, and in Greek, like the character of Hercules and the character of Samson, very, very similar. And then you also when you take into account that Hercules originates in, I think it was either Tyre or Tyra, I forgot how you pronounce it, or it was somewhere in the Phoenician region where they had their Hercules, and it just seems like maybe seems to be just this zeitgeist during that period.
Yeah, that's right. I agree. There's an interesting correlation there. I've heard it said, not often, but I've heard it said that you might say the heroic literature of the Old Testament, which corresponds to the heroic literature of the Greeks, would be the Book of Judges. And certainly Homer's account of the Iliad and Odyssey and the whole story it paints is purportedly telling a story that would have taken place about the same time, because it was the Trojan War was sometime around, say, 1220 BC, and that's right in the middle of the period of the Judges. So there's some very interesting parallels there for sure.
And is it so that was also around the time, shortly after with about 100 years after the Trojan War, and it was more of like a gradual process, but the entire ancient because what a lot of people don't really like when they look back at history, a lot of people, and you and I of course both know this, but view it as like a gradual progression. Like a long time ago they were way more primitive, and then over time everything became more complex. But the Bronze Age, they had globalization, not on the same scale as us, but all of these interconnected societies, and they just mysteriously collapsed around 1150 BC, and that's around the time the Judges takes place. Do you think that maybe some of the stuff, all the chaos going on in the Book of Judges, is somehow linked to that international event going on?
The so-called Dark Age of that, and it does seem like virtually all the ancient nations kind of go dark for around 200 years, and then they start waking up around the year 900 or a little earlier, BC. So say from 1100 to 900, roughly. What's interesting to me is that does correspond to what the Old Testament regards as the kingdom era.
That was actually something that I wanted to ask about, how maybe, because a lot of, like I was talking about the Exodus, there's like a lot of historians who make it their mission to try to disprove that, similar to the kingdom of David. Is it possible that maybe we never hear about the kingdom of David in many other sources other than the Bible is because of that dark age? And maybe that was like one of the only kingdoms that managed to kind of come out of it.
Yeah, it could be. There have been some modest archaeological discoveries indicating that there was a king named David. So we're a little past just thinking he was pure fiction. But I think it's very interesting that the time of Israel's ascendancy under her greatest rulers was a time when the rest of the nations were more or less quiet. The rise of the Assyrians came right at the end of the reign of Solomon, when things began to degenerate a little bit. So whatever else we make of it, it seems to me that the period when Israel was at her greatest, it does also translate into a time when apparently the surrounding nations were in a period of some peace. And if nothing else, that's a very interesting aspect of the whole story. Before that, there was a lot of activity, a lot of violence, a lot of warfare, and after there was, but during that period, the kind of golden age of Israel, things were fairly quiet on the Western Front. So whatever we do with that, it's an interesting little feature of history.
In a lot of ways, so it almost is like the Bible. So most ancient cultures had a very cyclical view of history. And at face value, it looks like, and that's because the idea of linear history really came about because it comes from the Christianity in a lot of respects. Yeah. But if you really look deeper, even though the Bible is written in a linear fashion, if you look deeper, it's a very cyclical book, just about all these about the Jews and how they sort of rise and then decline, whether it's them sort of falling away and turning to pagan, for instance, they worshipped, you had Aaron who was like, hey, Yahweh is a bull, let's build a Babylonian-esque statue, and then angered Moses and all that. But that's just one example. And then another one, you have even the great kings, David and Solomon, were responsible, albeit maybe a little bit indirectly, but so they were not perfect. And in their arrogance, they had long-term effects of ultimately shattering the kingdom into two parts. But in terms of but David, though, you have the Philistines. So it's been more or less confirmed by this point. The Philistines were were Mycenaean Greeks originally. And that they might also have potentially been the Sea People as well. However, that's a completely different topic. But
a combination of the both. Yeah, it could be both.
Yeah, so it's almost, what I find interesting is you look at how Homer describes the great heroes of Troy. So everyone from Achilles to Agamemnon, Ajax, and very similarly, Goliath is described in a very similar way in terms of the armor and the weaponry and complexion and even the fighting styles, the one-on-one combat.
Right.
As opposed to sort of these mass battles that you'd see later on with Alexander the Great and stuff. Right. They almost add up in a sense. And I've always thought, I think it's very possible that Goliath and the Philistines, they were the Achaeans described, and it was another one of their attempted conquests.
Yeah. It could be. I think certainly the archaeological work that's been done in the major cities of the Philistines has been really striking, because you're right, it's Mycenaean pottery and art, and it's certainly not Canaanite. And so it says that these people, whoever they were, certainly were not indigenous Canaanites, that they'd gotten there somehow or other by virtue of a great migration. And it could have been in connection with the Sea People. That's a little bit of a mystery, but it seems that maybe the Sea People came in and took along with them Mycenaeans. This whole thing took place over an extended period of time. But Yeah, the
These things don't
Philistines
just happen all at once.
they marched to their own drummer. They were a little bit of a different breed of folks out there, that's for sure.
What I've always found kind of funny is how the term Philistine is like associated, or traditionally it's not used that much anymore, but as a lowercase noun and a verb used to describe
Right.
like a barbarian. Whereas
Yeah.
they haven't, I believe they found that the actual Philistines were far more civilized than
Very sophisticated. Absolutely. Right.
And but then going on to after that, David and Solomon. So yeah, we mentioned that would be when all the other kingdoms were in their dark age.
Mm-hmm.
But then, so could you sum up more, like, because you definitely know more about this particular period than I do, but what happened between Solomon's death and the Babylonian exile, and then from there we'll move on to the final discussion on Babylon.
Well, the civilization that really kind of begins to rise and become threatening were the Assyrians, and that there had been a kind of a proto-Assyrian period which was much earlier and actually played a factor back at the Battle of Kadesh and all that, but the Assyrians began to develop some horsepower once again around the year 900. You got Tiglath-Pileser and successors and so on, and they were powerful and brutal, and so all during that period, let's say from the death of Solomon down to 722, the constant threat is always Assyria, northern Mesopotamia, and they were on constant wars of conquest. The Assyrians, basically, their strategy was to conquer and pillage, and that was their revenue stream. And so when they needed more revenue, they just went out and conquered and pillaged again. You see, and they would disrupt people and haul them off and that sort of thing. And that all sort of culminated in terms of Jewish history in 722.
No wonder Jonah hated them then.
Yeah. Well, that's right. The last thing he wanted to do was see God show them any mercy. But basically, the Assyrians were kind of at the height of their power as we approached the time of Ashurbanipal and so on, that later era.
Is he the one who built the library?
Yeah, Ashurbanipal's library. That's where we found, all of those great artifacts, Gilgamesh epic and Enuma Elish, and all of those were actually found in his library there, written in cuneiform.
I know there was a time, like, I think that was discovered, it was mid 19th century, until like before that was like one of the very first written accounts of a flood. Mm-hmm. And before that, for the longest time, like, because within like the rationalism of the Enlightenment. Mm-hmm. So you had some Enlightenment historians and philosophers who completely discounted the idea of there being a flood altogether. But then that almost renewed the belief, or like the belief in a flood. Yeah.
Well, there was a guy named Austin Henry Layard who was sort of like the 19th century version of Indiana Jones, and he went out and he was determined to find Nineveh. He wasn't a trained archaeologist because there was no such thing really as archaeology back then. But he just went out and by hook and crook and a lot of adventures was able to actually locate the city of Nineveh, and within it found Ashurbanipal's library, which was this huge underground sort of extended cavern, and so he hauled all kinds of stuff out of there. Of course, he couldn't read any of it because it was in cuneiform, but over the next several decades, people were able to decode it, and that was where a lot of those ancient epics came from, was the discovery of that library. So it was kind of a turning point in interest in biblical stories, and it proved that there were Assyrians and that they were kind of a great empire, which had been discounted by a lot of the, like you say, the Enlightenment types. That sort of dismissed the whole notion that there was an Assyria up until then.
So and then and then the Assyrians. So did the Assyrians? I believe I don't know, forget if this was the order, but was it? So Judah was conquered, or was it Israel? One. It was either whichever one had Jerusalem in it, I think.
Yeah, they survived till later. So the 10 northern tribes called Israel in the Old Testament were deported by the Assyrians. It was Sargon and Shalmaneser that were responsible for that. And then the Assyrians themselves collapsed about 100 years later in the year 612 by a combined attack of the Medians on the one hand and the Babylonians.
Were the Medians a vassal state of the Babylonians at this time?
Yeah, well, it changed abruptly, and the Babylonian king was Nabopolassar, whose son was Nebuchadnezzar.
I love Babylonian names of the kings.
Yeah, that's right.
So much fun.
And the Median king was Cyaxares, and so as it turns out, the daughter of Cyaxares married the son of Nabopolassar. And so that formed an alliance between the Babylonians and the Medians for a time. Assyria fell cataclysmically at that point. And then you've got kind of twin stories. You've got the Medes and the Persians, which basically carry on their story to the north, while the Babylonians are more dominant to the south. And that, over the next couple of hundred years, is kind of the story of the Middle East, in terms of those two powers.
It's always been chaotic.
Yeah.
Yeah. The center of where civilization began. It's like everyone's fighting over
right.
it for thousands and thousands of years. But the Babylonian exile. This was the final topic wanted to discuss. But so what I find interesting, so one major theory is that the Old Testament as we know it finally coalesced during or after the exile. And a lot of interesting things add up, because a lot of the stories of Genesis prior to, Genesis and then through at least the Judges. I mean, I think the Kings you can, I think, single out as kind of being their own thing. But a lot of Genesis through Exodus, the things that those stories talk about, the themes almost run parallel to sort of the conditions that the Jews were living in during the Babylonian exile. Like you see, for instance, you look at the like we mentioned the creation, the cosmic ordering of creation was the complete inverse of the Babylonian one, kind of like they're trying to, it's kind of like a jab at them. And then you see the story of the flood, where they make it one of their own primordial ancestors as opposed to Utnapishtim. Now it's possible Utnapishtim and Noah were actually two different names for the same person, but either way, there's definitely differences in how they're characterized. But then you also get to the Tower of Babel, which, and I recall, I don't know if it was Nebuchadnezzar who did, but but there was a giant ziggurat that was either being built or refurbished by Nebuchadnezzar, and they called the Tower of Babel, which is similar to etymologically possibly related to Babylon. So it's almost like they're doing a parallel, and they're like, oh yeah, it's always been like this evil place of like separation from God. And so there's the parallel between the Tower of Babel and the historical ziggurat Nebuchadnezzar was building. And then the Exodus, that's the big one. The Exodus being compiled, there's a lot of parallels between the Babylonian captivity and the slavery in Egypt. And it's almost like they're saying, God he delivered us from slavery in Egypt. He'll deliver us from slavery in Babylon, like to give them a sense of hope. Even if it or at least, I mean, I know like regardless of the literal veracity of the Exodus, I mean, either way, it still definitely parallels the exile in Babylon. What would you, what do you have to, you have any comments on that?
I think it's one of those situations where you can understate or overstate that. There are some who would say, well, the Bible was sort of written out of whole cloth in the post-exilic period. I think that is probably pushing a little too hard to make a point that is driven more by a kind of a theological agenda than by decent historical.
Because I remember traditionally, I think it was like Genesis. Is it Moses or?
Yeah,
I think.
Well,
that's the traditional view.
First 5 books traditionally written by Moses. The difficulty is that the very mode of writing and the transmission of documents and so on, the technology involved was quite different in much earlier periods, which is not to say it wasn't possible to write stuff down, but the form in which it was written and transmitted was a little different than what you have much later. So I don't have any problem at all with the idea that as you reach a later period, the post-exilic period, that a variety of different sources came down, probably oral tradition and written sources as well, that were all more or less combined, edited, redacted, and so on, during that period to give us what eventually became the final form of the Old Testament. It seems to me something like that must have happened. But that it was made up out of whole cloth, I think, is really discounting the importance that was
the oral
attached
tradition
by the oral tradition, even probably written sources. There's all kinds of books that are referred to in the Old Testament that don't exist today.
The Bronze Age collapse was probably a
big
reason for that.
Yeah, it could be, but I think there were sources, to be sure, probably a lot of them, and somebody along the line sat down and had to start kind of putting the puzzle pieces together. And so somewhere in the middle, I think makes the most sense. I don't think that what we have as the 5 books of Moses as we have them today probably corresponds to what he sat down and wrote. As such, but at the same time, it seems pretty clear there was a guy named Moses, and he did have a huge impact, and he did leave a pretty important legacy behind him, and that was important to later generations. So I want to give some credence to the traditional view that's something like that happened.
Yeah, and I just wanted to clarify, like when I've said certain things about when I was clarifying, like what if the Exodus didn't happen? I wasn't saying that that's what I believe. I was just saying that there's some, I think there's a lot of like room for interpretation in some of these regards. But yeah, so and then finally the exile comes to an end with the coming was it the Achaemenids? I think the Persians.
Well, the end of the Babylonian exile actually is from Cyrus the Great, who was Persian, and he conquered Babylon in 539 and authorized shortly thereafter Jewish people to return to Jerusalem and start rebuilding their temple. And the problem was Cyrus himself died in 530, and his son Cambyses was not nearly as favorable to that project, and so it seems to have stalled out for a while. But then eventually there was a king named Darius. Darius the Persian fought the first Persian War with the Greeks, but he also reauthorized finishing the temple. So the temple was actually finished and went back into operation in about the year 516 BC, exactly 70 years after the temple was destroyed in 586 BC. And so that seems to be the 70-year period that we hear of in the Old Testament.
Okay.
And from that point on, the temple was in operation, and it was really the Persians who were largely responsible for funding and supporting the Jewish interest in rebuilding the temple.
And so it is around, and then it's around this time. I remember I said in the email to you, so this is, or it was the period from Genesis to the the coming of the Persians that I wanted to make the topic of discussion here, because it's really around this time when history starts picking up in terms of like all the records that we have, and the Bible becomes more and more more and more verifiable in terms of like telling more of like empirically literal, like the Maccabean revolt, that by that point, that part of the Bible is like a history. It's like literal history by that point. But and so you really start to see that, I know, of starting around the time of the coming of the Persians. But
Right.
And because like that was the beginning of Judaism or rabbinical.
Well, it was, yeah, you would say Judaism. In other words, up until the Babylonian captivity, the Jewish world was temple-centric. But when the temple was removed, then I've heard people say it became Torah-centric. That was part of why there was a great new interest in the Torah, because with the absence of the temple, the centerpiece for Jewish religion became a set of documents, rather than a physical structure. So even when the temple was rebuilt and went back into operation, the center in many ways of the Jewish religious world was more the synagogue. And the synagogue was a place where the Torah was in center of attention. And the temple was important and certainly was in operation, but it was not quite the same significance it had once had.
Okay, and then so the final thing, I feel like on a good way to end this on a kind of a poetic note, which sort of foresees the coming of the New Testament. So this is really around the time where we start to see the first messianic ideas like being written in the Bible, at least as and then there with the coming of also Cyrus the Great freeing them as well.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of that, like the coming of a king or the coming of a king, just the concept of the Messiah in general.
Mm-hmm.
What's in that regard? Do you think that placing like the rise of messianism as sort of a popular Jewish theological position, do you think that it's overstated to say that it began with the coming of the Persians and the Zoroastrians, who had that very linear, they had that strict monotheism and that linear view of time? Do you think there's a link, so number one, a link between the events of Cyrus sort of being a savior of the Jewish people and also the religion coming into contact?
Yeah, interesting. In the Old Testament, the only non-Jew who's ever called Messiah, an anointed one or a Messiah, is Cyrus the Great. Many Jewish people had that title. I don't know. I'd be reluctant to put too much freight on that, because you do have the whole Son of David idea that seems to have much, much deeper roots in the Jewish heritage. So the whole idea of King David having a son who would be the greater son of David, who is then tied to Messiah, Psalm 110 and so on, suggests that that wasn't, or didn't originate quite that late, that it was, it was certainly tooled up, as you get into a later era, and especially in the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, all of them really beat the drum for a coming Messiah. But even there, you've got a pretty good argument to make that they're reflecting, what had already been a fairly well-established expectation. So I guess I'm saying it's both and. I think it certainly gained horsepower in that later period, but that there was already something pretty well defined in the Jewish expectation that had its roots earlier than that.
Yeah, this is going a little briefly off topic, but this is just something I wanted to note. So I find it really ironic and like very sad in a poetic way that, so this ties it into back to World War II with the Holocaust and Nazi Germany, how they called themselves Aryans, and they committed against the Jews, which is the entire Old Testament is their story. Right. So how the worst genocides in human history committed against them by people who called themselves Aryans, whereas in the Old Testament it was the Aryans, the actual Aryans, like in the historical sense, the Indo-European Persians, who saved them.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
I just find that just kind of a
Yeah,
messed up irony.
it is a messed up irony. I couldn't put it better. That is exactly right. And because the term Aryan, Hitler wanted to make it connected to kind of the Nordic, white-skinned, blonde, blue-eyed type folks, and it was anything but that,
Yeah.
historically. But
Yeah.
anyway.
I mean, because like that term, even before that, historically referred to everyone from like Europeans to Indians. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. But yeah, so one final question for you. And just kind of sums up the entire theme of what we were talking about, or what we've been talking about for the past definitely more than an hour. But why do you think it is so important to analyze the Bible and analyze Scripture by looking at what was also going on in the world around them? Why is that fundamentally important to advancing our understanding of the scriptural truth?
Well, I guess that's a great question, and my kind of limited answer to it is there is no book in the history of the human race that has sold more than the Bible. That all by itself should be a justification for any sensible person to pay attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
Then, in addition to that, it is an ancient source. It's not a book that was written 15 years ago and made it to the New York Times bestseller list. It is a book that, by anybody's measures, traces back deeply into ancient history. How it came to be, what the particular forces were, and so on, of course, remains an interesting topic for PhDs to write theses about. But that it has its roots deep in ancient human history is in itself, a very important thing that is noticeable about it. And the fact that it purports to tell us things that actually happened. It doesn't come across simply giving us platitudes. It doesn't just give us poetry, lovely thoughts, It actually, at least on its face, says, okay, here's what actually happened historically at this particular time and place. And insofar as it's at least purporting to give us history, and insofar as we have any other clue about what might have been happening, it seems to me that it invites us to ask those broader questions, and that maybe the Bible helps shed light on other events in history, and certainly other events in history help shed light on the Bible. I know people are hostile in some cases to the Bible. I don't understand that. Even if you're not a Christian, even if you don't give a whit about, the Christian claim or anything like it, just as a pure historical document,
Exactly.
It seems to me that it warrants a second look. I mean, we read Herodotus. We know that everything Herodotus said wasn't exactly historically accurate.
No, like the important thing about Herodotus was most like the concept. He basically wrote the first history book based upon the idea of like cause and effect.
Yeah,
and
so we pay
yeah.
attention to him just because of that in itself makes him important. It seems like the Bible should be given at least that much.
Yeah, I mean, plus, I mean, even. So it's a pretty obscure book, but recently I read Voltaire. Voltaire was I want to call him an anti-theist, but he was a deist, and he was definitely very, very, very critical of the church. Yeah. But so in his philosophy of history, so this was during the Enlightenment, where there was a lot of skepticism against religion, but even he talked about how, okay, so because we don't know that this happened, what happened during this time, and the only source is the Bible, we are going to make the irrational assumption, because we have nothing else, that the Bible, we need to plug this in here because that's all we have. And it's like people who are so concerned with disproving all these things, who consider themselves rationalists, empiricists. Like I don't understand why they're not taking the view of like Voltaire, who's one of the greatest, the greatest thinkers of the past several hundred years. So yeah,
I agree.
But yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed talking to you. I'm sure that my audience will do it too. Maybe sometime we'll have to do the same thing on the New Testament.
Oh, that'd be great. Look forward to it.
All right. So
right.
Bruce Gore, everybody. What's the name of your book so I can promote that?
It's a very catchy title. Historical and chronological context of the Bible. You see, that's worth half the price right there. So,
So, okay.
But if someone goes to Amazon and types in my name, Bruce Gore, it'll pop right up. And so it's, it'll cost you about whatever, $30 or so. It's 600 pages long. It's got lots of pictures and maps and stuff in it. So it's a textbook. It was written for high school students, and so it's pretty accessible, I think, to any person interested in the topic.
Okay. Well, again, everybody, it's Bruce Gore. Thank you again so much
Absolutely.
for coming on. Very enlightening conversation.
Thank you.
So, yeah, you have a fantastic evening, and stay safe out there with everything going on.
Thanks a lot.